Hi, welcome to this neuroscience course. Briefly, I want to talk about a couple um, things in the history of neuroscience. So, neuroscience has got kind of a fascinating history. For a very long time, people really didn't know what to do with the brain, and that's what neuroscience, not entirely, but very often sort of focuses on. They didn't know what to do with the brain, and they also didn't know what to do with necessarily with nerves in general. So, for example, in ancient Egypt, we often got people not really knowing what to do with the brain during the process of mummification, so they just sort of throw it away. They did understand what happened when the brain was damaged. They knew people sort of went a little bonkers, but they didn't really know what to do with it, and they felt that the heart was the center of thought. So heart and thought. Later on, when we get to ancient Greece, that was a common opinion as well, that the heart was the center of thought. The brain was thought by some, including Aristotle, just right here, Greece. It was thought to cool the blood. In a way, it sort of does, because it takes a lot of the metabolic energy that the blood delivers. Doesn't physically cool it, but it sort of drains that metabolic energy out of it. But really, that's wrong, because it doesn't lead to a decrease in temperature. If anything, burning off all those calories increases the temperature. And it was thought that that decreasing of the temperature of the blood, if that was damaged, if that wasn't able to occur, and people went crazy because the blood got too hot. So Aristotle was a big believer in that. Hippocrates, however, he believed that the brain was the center of perception, essentially, which of course it is. He was in the minority opinion of this for quite a while. When we got to Rome, we have the famous physician Galen, who worked on a lot of gladiators, and he realized when these guys get hit in the head, bad stuff happens, and it's not all hot-headedness, I guess we could call it. And so he dissected dead gladiators, essentially, and he also, I believe, dissected animals as well. And he noted that the brain controls motor function and sense, so perception, essentially. And he correctly deduced that the cerebrum was responsible for sense, and the cerebellum was responsible for coordinating muscle movements. So that is sort of the ancient history of neuroscience. Then, if we sort of fast forward a little while and recognize that during the Middle Ages, people were not totally unpreoccupied by medicine, but very preoccupied with statehood, statecraft, and figuring out how they were all going to live in Europe together. At least in Europe, they were concerned with that. Not a lot of progress was made on this subject until the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, Galen's view sort of prevailed, but he didn't know all that much about the brain. One thing people had noticed is if you sort of cut open a brain, say this is a brain, it's got these little ventricles in here, which are sort of holes, and they're filled with fluids. And so Galen thought, well, those fluids are the humors, and so people thought, I guess, those fluids are the humors, and humors control sort of our mood and health and whatnot. And so they thought, well, maybe the brain controls the body by pushing these humors around, and then those humors maybe hydraulically move our muscles, which is, of course, incorrect. Descartes actually thought if you got an eyeball here, that this will project onto here what we're seeing inside the ventricles. Also incorrect. And it wasn't really until we started in the 19th century we started to see a lot of progress in the ways of looking at the brain. One of the things that help with that is the advent of sort of more knowledge on electricity. Once people started using wires, they could say, well, maybe there's a little bit of electrical nature to the brain instead of a physical, mechanical, I guess a mechanical nature to how the brain works. people started to see the brain as sort of a collection of wires. And eventually, it was actually discovered that the brain emits, so I'll just draw a little battery. It creates electricity, and that electricity can control muscles. And so that's where I'm going to leave for our history of how neuroscience sort of started, because this is where it starts to pick up. And this is where people start realizing things that are actually pretty useful in determining or in making progress in neuroscience. So the recognition that the brain is essentially electrical, not a mechanical organ, really helped. Also, one other thing I'd like to mention is one of the experimental methods that really helped push neuroscience was experimental ablation. So if you have like the brain here, it's got a cerebellum, it's got like a little brain stem here. One of the things that helped the early scientists figure out what the brain actually did, this is pretty clever of them, is they take an animal and they'd sort of like cut out this section of the brain and see, oh, what happened? Did that keep the animal from sensing or moving or whatever? And so this did help them understand very early principles on the brain, but it's also going to be something that we're going to talk about as we talk about 19th century views, and progress in neuroscience is experimenting on making changes to the brain and seeing what that did or does to animals.